Welcome to our program on Kardec Radio. And now, here's our host, Dr. Vanessa Anceloni.
Welcome, dear listener, to Kardec Radio. We are here with our second show of 2012. Many beautiful things are going to be offered to you because our goal here at Kardec Radio is really to nourish your soul. And to nourish our souls is to give nutrients so we can expand our minds and strengthen our relationships in our lives, because after all, as you know, this life is all about learning so we can progress in our immortality. And we're so honored that Dr. Sidney Greenfield is here with us. He is professor of anthropology emeritus at the University of Wisconsin, and he is author or editor of 7 books, and is producer, director, and author of 5 documentaries. He has a very long experience in anthropology. And it's beautiful because you may be asking, what is anthropology? And I'll give you his very quote in the book from Kroeber's paper in 1921. Anthropology is the interrelation of what is biological in man and what is social and historical in him. It's quite interesting because from Kardec's point of view, we should really see life from that perspective. And he is mainly going to talk about amazing experiences he lived, especially in Brazil, with healing mediums. And it was published actually in 2008 in the book entitled Spirits with Scalpels, The Cultural Biology of Religious Healing in Brazil. Quite fascinating. So fascinating that it deserves many opportunities to talk to him. And as I was just talking to him on the phone, I hope we have enough time today to learn as much as we can from his experience. And let us talk about healing now. We are talking about the fact that we all, no human being on this earth, if you ask, unless they are, of course, babies and children, they are not thinking about healing, maybe, not consciously yet, unless they are challenged by life in that regard. But adults in general, they are always searching for some form of healing, whether emotional healing, physical healing, and even social healing, not to say spiritual healing. And when we talk about healing, since ancient times, we hear accounts of men and women who got healed by the healing touch of gifted people. We talk about them as healing mediums. Jesus is the healer of all healers, undoubtedly, but since ancient times we hear about healing mediums. And Kardec asked this very question in the Spirit's book, Question and Answer 556. Do certain individuals really possess the gift of healing by simple touch? And the answer of the illuminated spirits was, their magnetic power may act to that extent when it's aided by purity of sentiments and an ardent desire to do good, for then good spirits come to their aid. It is necessary, however, to distrust the way stories are told by very gullible or enthusiastic individuals who are always ready to see the miraculous in the simplest and most natural things. One must always distrust the self-interested claims of persons who exploit credulity for their own profit. So Kardec receives this answer that talks about a magnetic power that resides in people and is driven by feelings, willingness to do good, and spirits who join forces with these healing mediums to bringing the healing. And the second part of this answer talks about people who talks about stories in an enthusiastic way. It's not the point of view of Dr. Greenfield. He's actually a scholar a true scientist of the human mind that brings this scientific perspective, the description of what is happening when people are being healed, especially in the scenario of healing mediumship. And it's quite interesting because in the opening of his book, we hear him quoting a paper that was published in the New England Journal of Medicine in the year of 2002, in which they were reporting many patients who received simulated surgery on their arthritic knees, and they were talking about placebo surgery, and these patients actually experienced less pain after this placebo surgery. So is what we are here talking about placebo? What is it? Nowadays, neuroscience especially is investigating the effects in the brain of placebo medication, placebo approaches. What is this all about? How can we explain it? Are there actually spirits there? Who are they? So let's talk about these phenomena that we're investigating. And to kickstart it, let us remind ourselves of this beautiful quote that was brought by one of the teachers of Dr. Greenfield, Margaret Mead. She said in class, and he quotes in his book, Spirits with Scalpels, anthropology demands the open-mindedness in class, with which one must look and listen, record in astonishment and wonder at that which one would have been able to guess. Last week, when we were talking about Allan Kardec, an exclusive interview with Divaldo Franco, the greatest Brazilian medium still incarnated, we're talking about the concept of cultural competency, and this is very much what we're talking about. Not only being understanding, but integrating these features in our lives. Here, we're going to investigate a little more. It's inevitable that Brazil has become the land of healing mediums. Why? Why is this there? We're going to discuss this. And if you have a question, you can call us and ask Dr. Greenfield your question, 858-769-4705, and we'll be here. If you are in the chat room at blogtalkradio.com/Kardec Radio, you also are welcome to write us your question or call us. We would love to talk to you and listen from you. By the way, Kardec Radio has a challenge for you. If you go to KardecRadio.com, we have a beautiful challenge. What is it? In question 876 of the Spirit's book, Kardec brings about this true criterion for justice in life, which is desiring for others what we would like for ourselves. And he says it's different from desiring for ourselves what we would desire for others. What is the actual difference there? Write your short dissertation. Doesn't need to be a PhD thesis on this. Send it to us at KardecRadio.com. And in the last show of February 25th, we're going to bring the winner because a committee at Kardec Radio is going to evaluate the dissertation on it. And the winner is going to come and talk to us on the show of February 25th. And also is going to win the first 6 foundational books of Allan Kardec. As beautiful as they are, you can also find them at ediceiofamerica.com or at amazon.com. Now, dear friends, when we're looking for healing, we need to keep our optimism up and to open this show in the highest tone. Let us call the voice of the spirit mentor Joana de Angelis through the mediumistic hands of Divaldo Franco in the book Living and Loving to talk about keep your optimism.
Chapter 6. Keep your optimism.
The dispirited companion who walks by your side may be facing a crucial ordeal. That friend of yours who slipped into delinquency may have tried hard to avoid crime. The other one who succumbed to vice may have fought against it but was not strong enough. The co-worker who discontinued service might have tried to stay in his place but was unable to comply. The friend who suddenly became your enemy may not have been able to overcome his pernicious tendencies. People acting negatively need understanding rather than criticism. Some might have wished to act differently but could not help themselves. A few others may be secretly trying to fight their negative drives. Many may have already acted as anonymous heroes but are now in disgrace. All of them need a new opportunity to prove themselves that they can change their behavior. They may never ask for help. Still, they should be given a new chance. Consider the positive side of people's actions and forget their weaknesses. Do not reject them. It is easy to fraternize with nice and diligent people always willing to cooperate and serve. It is agreeable to enjoy the company of worthy persons. But they also have problems of which you probably know nothing about. The earth is both a school and a hospital for unhealthy souls. Nobody living on earth now is an exception from this rule. It is useless to seek the company of angels, since they are not incarnate on earth now. All people on this planet bear the same characteristics as yourself. They suffer, have their own limitations, and they want to live in peace, and they dream with happiness. Try not to comment on the deficiency of others. If you cannot help them, keep silent and excuse them when they hurt you. Do not be disheartened by their behavior. If you know what you are looking for and are willing to serve, go on acting as you know best and be gentle to all who come your way. Do not harbor grief or disappointment within your heart. Be an optimist. Help those who have gone astray back to the right road. Abandoned and betrayed, Jesus was never disheartened. Never did he display resentment. He was the great winner of all the battles that life reserved for him.
We will return to our program after these messages.
Kardec Radio, live, every Saturday at 11 a.m.
Nourish your soul with Kardec Radio.
Now available for purchase, the book Chico Xavier, Medium of the Century by Guy Léon Playfair. This is the first biographical and critical study in English of one of the outstanding mediums of all time, through whom more than 450 books were received by automatic writing over a 70-year period, few of which until recently were available in English translations. Purchase your copy today at www.roundtablepublishing-uk.com www.roundtablepublishing-uk.com.
The newest edition of the Medium's book by Allan Kardec is now available. Purchase your copy online or via your ebook reader. Simply go to www.ediciofamerica.com today.
Nourish your soul with Kardec Radio.
Join us every Thursday live. Evolution in Two Worlds. A journey of the soul through the teachings of the Spirit Doctor, Andrea Luiz. Connect at www.tvcei.com, Channel 2.
Nourish your soul with Kardec Radio.
The Spiritist Society of Baltimore will be holding a special lunch following a movie on January 22nd from 12:30 p.m. to 3 p.m. at the Riscom Mansion in Baltimore, Maryland. There will be delicious Brazilian food. Bring your family and friends for a wonderful day. For more details, go to www.ssbaltimore.org. That is www.ssbaltimore.org. SSBALTIMORE.org.
And now we return to our program.
Healing and Spirits with Scalpels with Dr. Sidney Greenfield. We're here to learn more about the anthropologic view on healing mediumship, especially in Brazil. For some reason, it's a land that has become, surrounded by the phenomenon of healing mediumship, though we know it's not only there, because God is great and brings healing mediums all over the place. And we are honored to have Dr. Sidney Greenfield with us. He is Professor Emeritus in Anthropology and at the University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee, and he's author of several books, producer, director, and author of video documentaries, and he has a very, very extent experience in investigating about healing mediumship. And this is from a scientific perspective. So we want to know more about it. Dr. Sidney Greenfield, thank you so much for joining us at Kardec Radio today.
Thank you, Vanessa. It is my pleasure.
Dr. Greenfield, reading especially this book, Spirits with Scalpels, that was published in 2008, we've got to know the many cases of healing mediums you've closely investigated while in Brazil. But from an anthropologic view, why did you get interested in this phenomenon?
Well, let me tell you, it was basically by accident. I didn't go to study healer mediums. I didn't go to study Kardecisim. It happened essentially by accident, as I tell the story in the book. I was a visiting professor on a Fulbright grant at the Federal University of Ceará in Fortaleza in 1981. And just sitting and reading the newspaper, a name popped out. It was the name of one of my godsons who happens to live in the state of Rio. And I read the story. And the story was about a healer medium who was in Fortaleza treating patients. So since I had a few days before I started classes, I said to my wife and daughter, why don't we go see what this is all about? And we got up early in the morning and went to the address that was published in the newspaper, which was downtown Fortaleza, and there was this big line of people waiting in the street about 6, 7 o'clock in the morning, and I went over to the person who was coordinating them, and I introduced myself, and I said, I'm an American academic here in Fortaleza, and I wonder if it would be possible for me to see José Carlos, the healer, and observe what he's doing. So when I finally got through, he took me up into this building, and I entered into a very, very small room in the inside of the home. It was somebody's home. And it's important in telling the story for those who have never been to Fortaleza. Fortaleza is 4 degrees south of the equator, which means that it is very, very hot. The sun is very, very strong. The coast of Ceará happens to have a beautiful breeze that makes it very livable, but in this tiny room with all of these people packed in, it was very, very hot. I was introduced to the healer, and I explained who I was and what I was interested in doing. That was observing him. And he looked at me and he said, are you writing for a newspaper or a magazine? And I said, no, I'm a scholar. If I write anything, it'll be for academic publications. He looked at me and he said, fine. You not only can observe me, you can help me. And he put a tray in my hands with scalpels, scissors, a glass of fluidified water, bandages, a whole series of other things. And I took this tray and I looked at him as he turned to what was to be his first patient. And he took a scalpel off of the tray in my hands and jammed it into the man's eye and rotated around and slid the eye out of the socket. He picked up a scalpel in the other hand, substituted a tweezer for the eye sticking out of the socket, and began to scrape the lens of the eye. Well, I was standing in front of him. Behind him were 20-odd people packed together, including my wife, who started to lose the color in her face, and I looked and I was afraid she was going to faint. And without looking at her or anything else, Jose Carlos reached his hand back, stroked her, the color returned to her face. He continued scraping the eye, and the eye was hanging out. He wasn't supporting it any longer. And he popped the eye back into the socket after scraping it and put a piece of tape over it and explained to the poor man. First place, he asked him, "Did you feel any pain?" And of course the man answered no. And he then gave him some dietary restrictions and said, "You will be fine, your vision will be completely okay," and went on from there. And we spent the entire day with him doing various kinds of surgeries, which of course at the end of the day, my wife and daughter and I sat down and said, "What's going on here? How do you explain the fact that this young man, who we learned talking to him, had a high school education, and that was all, and he did surgeries including cutting into people, removing tissue, without using any anesthesia, without any antisepsis. The people didn't feel any pain, and they said that they recovered, and later on when I did further research on this is exactly what I found." So after this, we decided, well, we're going to be here for a while. Why don't we continue visiting and observing all of this? And then, of course, when we asked the question, when we got home, who's going to believe us? So on the and after we told people when we came home, we got the usual reaction both from people and from doctors. It can't happen. It's all trickery. Don't believe it. You're being duped. You're being conned. So after that, on every other trip I took, we took a video camera and I filmed it. And this became the basis for the documentaries that I did, just observing and describing what was happening and being able to show people. And of course, what I then learned from talking to him and talking to other people there, that the background tradition here was Cardicism, which I knew very little about. But I had the further good fortune, while I was in Fortaleza, on this Fulbright grant, the Fulbright operation in Brazil and all other countries has this practice that anyone in any part of the country can invite a Fulbright scholar to talk about their research or anything else. And I received an invitation from a professor of education in Rio Grande do Sul, in Porto Alegre. And he wanted me to come to talk about anthropological methodology. It turned out, fortuitously, he had gone to the University of Wisconsin where he got his PhD in education, but was taught mainly statistical and mathematical models and methods, so he invited me there. When I met him, we became very friendly. We talked about our Wisconsin background and the like. And I mentioned what had happened with Jose Carlos. And he told me that he had a colleague on the Faculty of Education who was a Kardecist. And he introduced me to this wonderful man who then became my tutor in Kardecism. His name was Cicero Marcos Teixeira, and he was the director of a center in Porto Alegre, and I've gone back and visited him many times, and he prepared reading lists for me, and we had seminars and all kinds of things like that, where he taught me the background on Kardecism that I began to understand. So this was essentially my introduction to Spiritist healing and Kardecism. But what I have to add for your listeners, is as an anthropologist, my interest is in comparative religions. And this means that I study different religions, examining what their beliefs are, what this means for the behaviors of those who are believers. And what I'm especially fascinated by is the fact that when believers in different religions come together and share their experiences, they tend to borrow things from other religions. And what you wind up with is what anthropologists refer to as syncretism, that is the mixing of different beliefs and traditions. And to begin to answer a question that you posed early on, Brazil is distinctive because of what happened in Brazil's history. And this is the result of essentially syncretism, the mixing of different beliefs of the different populations of Brazil and the major religions that became the foundations of Brazilian culture. And what I'm referring to here is the pre-Reformation Roman Catholicism of Brazil, with the importance of saints and spirits of the dead and pilgrimage shrines and pilgrimages, the tradition of the shaman in Aboriginal Brazilian religions, where shamanistic practices are healing rituals. And the shaman essentially heals people. And to this was added the Afro-Brazilian tradition brought by the slaves of spirit possession. And all these were mixed together in a very fascinating way, because you had the syncretism of the Afro-Brazilian tradition with the tradition of the Roman Catholic saints, so that for a long period during slavery, for the slaves to be able to practice what they believe was their traditional religions, they had to mask it with the saints and speak as if the orishas that they were worshiping were really the Catholic saints. And you had this mixture going on where people were worshiping the orishas, the African deities, but were able to protect themselves by saying they were praying to the saints. And this worked together in a very fascinating way, that by the time Kardecism was introduced into Brazil, you had this tradition to build on of this wonderful mixture.
Yeah, it's so interesting you're saying this, because I want to make one question and a comment. I'll say the comment first and then link where you stopped to a question. For people who are listening to us and never heard of the term Kardecism, though we don't use it as much here in the Spiritist movement in the U.S., but it's more common in Brazil, for example, for the reasons that Dr. Greenfield was talking about. If you go to the Spirit's book, when Kardec introduces Spiritism in 1857, he says these very words: when new matters arise, new words are needed for the sake of clarity of language, in order to avoid the confusion inherent in multiple meanings for the same terms. And he says, Therefore, instead of the word spiritual and spiritualism for designating this later belief, we have coined and employed the words spiritist and spiritism. These two terms reflect their origin and their fundamental meaning, and they thus have the advantage of being perfectly understandable. And he keeps going by talking about the new terms. Kardec was an educator by excellence, and he needed to coin the terms, but as you said, culturally speaking, when he got to Brazil, it was facing a different reality in which this syncretism pushed the envelope, and people actually adopted the name and still do nowadays. Spiritism, though, it's not exactly what Kardec was proposing, and that's probably the need why some people feel of saying this new term, Kardecism, though Kardec never used it, but it's understandable for the reasons you have talked about. So then my question to you, as you open this cultural aspects of Spiritism, do you think the fact that we had this syncretism in Brazil, we had more, let's say, fruitful soil for the establishment of Spiritism or Kardecism, as you mentioned, whereas in the United States we still have lots more to struggle to really come to the level of the dissemination of Spiritism as in Brazil. Do you think the cultural differences are what made Brazil to succeed in the spreading of these religious ideas of Spiritism?
Definitely. As I mentioned, the pre-Reformation Roman Catholicism was such that people lived in a world of spirits, the saints and spirits of the dead who were part of their lives. And it's very important to make a distinction between the uses of Spiritism as you've just explained them. Because for Kardec and followers of Kardecism in Brazil, and for most of Brazil's popular religions, as they are called, Spiritism refers to the fact that there are spirits in the other world who interact with and influence the lives of the incarnate or living. We in the United States sometimes use the word spirit and spirituality to refer to a belief, a calmness, an understanding of spiritual life. The two are very different, and we in the United States, although some people who are staunch Roman Catholics, for example, believe that the saints are very much part of their lives. But in most of American culture, we don't accept that. We make a very clear distinction, which is a post-scientific understanding that the spirits stay in their world, and in our world, well, this operates in terms of science and rationality, and you keep the two separately. In Brazil, this doesn't always happen, and people move from really a kind of a separatist belief that they could move into a world of spirits and move out just as easily, for example, when they go to school and study science, and they can make this distinction. But once you add this idea of spirits and their influence, and you follow up on the notion that Kardec introduced this idea of a dual universe, a world of spirits and a world of the living, and the tie between them and their ability to influence each other, something very interesting happened in the beginning. And again, I referred to Brazil because I find this most fascinating, and it has tremendous implications, because as everybody who knows anything about Kardecism knows, that it is very important for people to use mediums to communicate with the dead, to receive messages from the dead, and their words that are very often very comforting. But what happened at the beginning, really, and this is in the shortly after Kardec's writings were introduced into Brazil by immigrants from France and the Brazilian elites, who at the time all spoke French, read Kardec in the original French, and discussed Kardec in French. But when people communicated with the spirits in the other world, and they did this through Ouija boards primarily. You know, this was where you spun letters and you spelled out words. And what they called table turning was a regular practice that people used to communicate with the spirits. Well, in Brazil, there were 3 factions that developed out of Kardec's writing, essentially. One was to treat it in the sense of evangelism as a religion. But in the late 19th century, before the Republic was established, Roman Catholicism was the official religion. And Kardecism was oppressed. And believers in Kardecism got in trouble because essentially it was against the law. The second branch or set of thinking in Kardecism was philosophic. And if you treated Kardec's teachings as philosophy, you were not subject to the oppression, the religious oppression. And this became a kind of secular philosophy as a way of thinking about Kardec's teaching. And then there were the third aspects, what were called the material effects, that during a seance, things happened. And the spirit world, people believe, tend to influence the material world in that things moved on the table. There were noises. There were things happening that people began to look into just in terms of the effects, which, of course, if you think about this, led into parapsychology and the whole tie between certain aspects of Kardecism and parapsychology. But what happened at the very beginning is that when some Kardecists began to communicate with the other world, they began to ask spirits about illnesses and people who were suffering from varying kinds of problems. And to their great surprise, healing spirits sent back messages that said, well, if you will try the following medicine, if you will do the following thing, very much as a prescription, which fit in so nicely with this old shamanistic practice of the session becoming a healing session, that, by the way, the patients didn't have to be present. What you needed was the medium to communicate the patient's symptoms, and the benevolent spirits would send back messages of what to do. And historically, at approximately the same time that Kardec was introduced into Brazil, homeopathy was introduced, the works of Samuel Hahnemann from Germany, which dealt with a different kind of medicine and a different understanding of medicine that was adopted by Kardecists. And if you go into a Kardecist center in Brazil today, many of them still have a full stock of homeopathic medicines that Americans, as part of alternative healing, are beginning to learn about homeopathy. But all of this fit together in Brazil as part of a healing tradition that Kardecist centers became involved in. And if you think about it, there were many, many people, poor people, who couldn't read, didn't understand Kardec, weren't involved in the French debates, but they heard from friends about people being healed, and they were sick, and they went for healing. And what this did was open up Cardicism to the entire population, that other people who were healed came to Cardicis centers to learn about Cardicism, and Cardicism spread throughout the population. But there was something else happening that was very important. And what that was is, at this time, in the late 1800s, this is when emancipation occurred in Brazil, and the slaves were freed. And with the great problems in the interior and the changeover from emancipation to freedom, large numbers of emancipated slaves came into the cities like Rio de Janeiro, cities like Porto Alegre and Salvador. And you had populations of Afro-Brazilians who began to practice their African-derived religious beliefs that we call candomblé and batuque and macumba and so on and so forth in their terreiros. And the terreiros were located down the street, so to speak, from the Cardicis centers. And some of the Cardicists visited the Afro-Brazilian centers and vice versa, and there was contact and communication. And there's a very significant difference between West African worshiping and European worshiping. Because Europeans worship the supernatural through the Word. They speak or pray silently, looking for messages, looking for help from the saints, looking for help from God in the Protestant tradition. And Africans, West Africans, and Afro-Brazilians do something different. That's spirit possession. And the spirits come down from another world and incorporate in the bodies of mediums who are trained to receive them. And when they are in the bodies of the mediums, they can interact physically with their worshipers. Well, if you think about this for a moment, when a number of Cardicists learned this and realized the possibility of spirits coming down from the other world to interact with the living, what they began to realize was that some spirits, these helping spirits who were sending prescriptions from the other world with medications, could take the next step. They could come down and incarnate temporarily in healing mediums, interact with the living, and practice medicine, including surgery, to help the living. And they could do this using the advanced techniques of the other world. That is, they could bring along with them, as they believed, the ways of providing antisepsis so that infections wouldn't develop, and ways of providing anesthesia so they could do surgeries without the patients feeling pain.
Yeah.
And little by little, this was introduced. Now, there are not many mediums who are capable of doing this, but periodically we find in Brazil, since the beginning of the 20th century, certain mediums are able to do this, and certain spirits. This becomes very important if you ask the question, why should a spirit in the other world who happened to have been a doctor in a previous incarnation want to return to the world of the living to do surgeries at a very intensive pace? You know, this is a commitment they have to make. And of course, if you go back to the basics of Kardec's words, This is charity. This is what the belief is all about. And besides, there's a notion of karma. That is, the good and the bad deeds a person does in a lifetime accumulate across the lifetimes, and a person has at any particular point in time a positive karma or a negative karma. And by coming back to the material plane and doing charity, many of these spirits who believed, and they did, have negative karmas, like the wonderful Dr. Fritz, who I studied and used through so many different mediums, did all kinds of bad things in his life, and he improved his karma by returning and helping people who were sick as charity. And of course, it's very important to know and to understand the dissemination and the increase in the number of people who have come to practice Cardicism as a result of being healed.
Yeah.
That this is charity. You don't charge.
Exactly.
Neither the medium nor the spirit charges the healing. So people begin and they experience the healing, they feel better, and they learn more, and some of them even learn to become mediums themselves.
Yes.
So what this comes out to in the end is that in Brazil, you have this development of healer mediums who do surgery, and the surgeries without anesthesia, without antisepsis, make it possible for this to happen, and what I was observing then becomes explained this way. And as I mentioned in the book, Edson Quiroz used this to defy people, to challenge people. After he would do a surgery, he would turn and give a lecture and say, well, how do you explain this? You can't explain it. It defies science. It defies medicine as we know it. Well, you can't think of another way to explain it. You have to understand Cardicism. And people would begin to study. So it was done as part of his attempt at proselytizing.
Yeah.
And I followed lots of people who were healed who have then become practicing Cardicists. One of the documentaries that I did was about a woman who had cancer. And she also had a bad heart. And when her doctor told her that her heart might not withstand the surgery to remove the tumor, a cousin told her about Edson Quiroz and spiritist surgery. Now, as you probably know, but many of your listeners might not know, Brazilians discuss their sicknesses. And they discuss their sicknesses with people close to them, their family members, close friends. That is, when they have symptoms, they discuss these. And people come in and say, well, I had something like that, and when my doctor couldn't help me, I went to an Umbanda session. I went to a Cardicist center. Why don't you try it? Well, this woman said, why don't I go to Recife and see what Edson Quiroz and Dr. Fritz can do? Well, after a long story, she survived. I followed her for a period of 11 years, and she felt so good about it, she became a Cardicist, and she went out and did charity with children in a favela, helping them. And this became the story of how the tradition operates and spreads. And it becomes interesting to me now with the number of Brazilians who come to the United States, who go to other parts of the world. whether they will be able to continue making this separation as they get caught up in American culture of saying there is the world of the spirits. Well, it seems not to fit with the scientism that seems to be dominant in American thinking and discussion, but it's also there. And these are the kinds of things we have to appreciate and understand, particularly to understand these spiritist healers and what the implications of this are for our general understanding.
Dr. Greenfield, I'm speechless, and many of our listeners as well. We're so amazed. We could keep going and just listen to you, because it's so beautiful to see how you collected the elements and built or rebuilt the story and the cultural aspects of it. It clarifies so many things, and we want to ask you more questions.
Okay.
We're just going to go.
Let me just say very briefly,
Sure.
This is anthropology. This is what anthropologists do, taking the stories people tell, what they are, putting them together, seeing overall patterns, and how they interrelate and can be played back into the way people behave and what the consequences are.
And that's beautiful. It's really beautiful. And we have still a lot of questions that we would like to ask you, as much as other people as well, of our listeners. But we're going to give a short break. We're going to stream right now a new segment named Spiritism in Your Life that has some features regarding this topic on healing. And then after the break, we'll come back with more.
Fine.
And okay?
Thank you, Shirley.
All right. So let us listen to this, dear listeners. Spiritism in Your Life.
Dear Cardiac Radio listeners, welcome to Spiritism in Your Life, a brief moment where we're going to discuss how to bring Spiritist teachings closer to your daily routine and your daily life. Today's show is about healing. And considering that topic, we want you to think about this. When you go into a hospital or to a medical appointment, what do you do before you go there? So, in other words, do you do any preparation before going to the hospital, before going to consultation or into an examination or surgery? Have you ever thought about this? And if it comes to your mind, a few things as, well, we have to book an appointment, call our medical insurance company, we have to set up our exams. Well, that's all important. But now, coming back to Spiritism, what can we do to prepare ourselves for these situations? Have you ever thought about this? Even before all this, you have to remember that your inner harmony, your thoughts, your ideas, everything has to be aligned and balanced. And how do you achieve that? Well, there's a very easy recipe that has been brought to us a long time ago, and we all know about it. How many of you ever thought about praying? And I mean praying for the doctor that's going to treat you and take care of you, for the mentors of the doctor, clarifying the thoughts and ideas of the whole health team that's going to be involved in your care. And also, we need to pray for the mentor of the hospital or the clinic, the protectors of that place. We need to pray for our mentors so they can also come along and help us, as well as praying to the incarnate and discarnate spirits. They are going through much more difficult situations than we are. And finally, we pray to God so God can bless all of us and help each one of us during the healing process. And what about asking God to give you the strength and the will and to align yourself with this beautiful divine energy that's going to give you the strength to go into any medical procedure, and be ready for it. Remember that the healing process starts way before you actually go into any treatment. It starts when you realize that there's a reason for everything that you're going through, and you have to go through the situation and learn from it. This is a learning experience. Dear listeners, you might be asking now, Marco, I know we have to pray, but what else? What else do we need to do? And I tell you that Dr. Bernie Siegel brought to us a list of things we need to remember before going into the medical treatment. Well, I'm going to bring a few of those. The first one is bring your favorite music. Music that inspires you to meditation and to good thoughts. Also, if you're going through surgery, ask the surgeons and anesthetists and everyone in the room to maintain a good attitude and repeat inspiring messages during the surgery. Another one is ask the surgical team to talk to you. Ask your help during the medical procedure. Although your body is resting, your soul is very, very alive. Also, talk to yourself and to your own body, projecting all those good thoughts onto your physical body, allowing you to have a fast recovery. And just the last one, remember all the people that are out there for you. Remember your friends, family, everyone that's directing their prayers to you at that moment, and try to connect to them too, because this is going to be also really important for your recovery after the medical procedure. So dear listeners, and we want you to remember that your healing process starts with you. We're now going to finish with a passage from the book Changing Attitudes by the Spirit Hamed, psychographed by Francisco do Espírito Santo Neto. In order to overcome a disease, we need to interpret the message of the symptoms and to make the necessary changes to harmonize our unbalanced mind. Thank you, and God bless us.
We will return to our program after these messages.
Enjoy this new release. We're Born for Love, by the renowned Brazilian scientist and researcher on reincarnation, Dr. Hernani Andrade. This novel describes one of the most extraordinary and genuine cases of reincarnation ever studied by Dr. Andrade's Brazilian Institute of Psychobiophysics Research in Sao Paulo State. Order your copy now at roundtable.uk@gmail.com or at www.roundtablepublishing-uk.com.
Spiritist Network, your gateway to on-demand Spiritist videos. www.spiritistnetwork.com.
Spread the word. Kardec Radio, to learn more about Spiritism.
Want to find a good way to explain life after physical death to kids or teenagers? Check out the book Message from a Teen in the Spirit World by the Spirit Neo Lucio and psychographed by Chico Xavier. In this book, a teenager named Carlos explains his impressions on the new life in the spirit realm with his discarnate relatives and new friends. Purchase your copy online at www.ssbaltimore.org.
The Spiritist Magazine is a trimestral digital periodical that publishes the latest news on the Spiritist thought and the movement in the USA and worldwide. Subscribe now at www.spiritistmagazine.com.
In the book, A Primer on Being Good by the Spirit May, psychographed by the medium Chico Xavier, explains in simple language appropriate for children two paths in life, the path of good or the path of evil. God has granted us the freedom to choose either one. Purchase your copy online at www.ssbaltimore.org.
And now we return to our program.
Dear listener, we're here talking about the very fact that there are healing mediums, and they are guided by very special spirit entities, spirit doctors such as Dr. Fritz and many others. Even we hear many people nowadays, especially through the healings that became worldly renowned, the John of God. So, Dr. Greenfield, we are learning so much from your accounts. And we see in your book, Spirits with Scalpels, that you've researched especially José Carlos Ribeiro, Edison Queiroz, Antônio de Oliveira Rios in Palmelo, Mauricio Magalhães in Campo Grande, and others. And this was published in 2008. And one question that came through one of our listeners in email was, you've probably have become acquainted with John of God as well. And why have you decided not to say anything in this book? Because he's not actually a spiritist per se?
No, it has nothing to do with that. I visited João de Deus, John of God, in Abadiânia many years ago. Only it was a very short visit, and I hadn't had time to go back and spend an extended period with him. And what I try to do in the book is just select out those mediums that I had the opportunity to spend enough time with and, feel really comfortable writing about them. And this was the only reason in fact, I should add that when I visited him in Abadiânia, I brought with me several medical doctors and other scholars to observe. And this was part of an effort that I made to bring colleagues who were willing to do it to come and observe the various forms of healing. So, no, João de Deus was very much part of what I was reporting on.
But, Dr. Greenfield, I remember when I was a preteen and through several spiritist centers at the time with my family, especially my grandmother, Amalia, at the time of Dr. Fritz, through Edison Queiroz. People talk about John of God nowadays, but there are several mediums. There have always been great mediums, healing mediums, that were striking in their healing techniques as much as even more of John of God. Would you agree with that?
Oh, yes. And, of course, when I show my age, back in the 1960s, I had an opportunity to go see a medium named Zearigo, who you probably heard of, who was the first to receive Dr. Fritz. Right. Unfortunately, I couldn't make it then, and it wasn't until Fortaleza that I was really able to devote time and energy to doing research on this. But again, remember, I've been doing this intensively for a period of close to 30 years when this book came out, and I've been writing about it ever since. And eventually you have to reach the point of saying, well, I've done so much research on it, now I want to publish something that I think is definitive. And I intentionally didn't do a book-length study because I wanted to give myself the time to observe and to learn more things. One thing that I want to add for your listeners is that Allan Kardec was a fascinating man who lived at a very interesting time because remember, in the mid-19th century, many of the debates on medicine and healing were taking place, and Paris was the center where these debates and trials and things were going on. And Kardec learned things. For example, he was active in the Mesmer Society. Franz Anton Mesmer, who lived a century before, who introduced what is considered a deviant form of medicine with this idea of animal magnetism, which developed into the healing fluids that Kardecists talk about. And Kardec understood Mesmer's thinking, and even though it and other things were marginalized from medicine as scientific medicine developed, these ideas were introduced into his thinking, and especially for what is important in terms of my research, and that is the idea that Mesmer really introduced, and it was developed through his student, the Marquis de Puységuer, the notion of hypnotism and hypnotherapy, which becomes important again as a deviant form that is marginalized by mainstream medicine, but becomes important in certain forms of healing. So what you're really getting is the introduction of other points of view that have been pushed aside in the development of the wonderful things medicine has been able to do, but there are a lot of things still that haven't been accomplished yet. And these are other perspectives, very much like the Kardecist, Spiritist surgeries that open up possibilities for other ways of thinking that may have implications for healing in the future.
So, as you talk about the Kardec and his time and these amazing historical elements you brought about, from your perspective, who was then Kardec?
Kardec was a Frenchman who was born in the early 19th century, who was widely read. He was a scholar and educator. He had an open mind. He learned about a lot of things. And now we get into an area that I have to be very careful with, because your audience is mostly believers in Kardec's thinking. And as I said at the beginning, I'm an anthropologist, and I come from a perspective of science. And I have the greatest respect for Kardecist beliefs, like I have the greatest perspectives for all other religions that I study. And what I have to do is say a lot of things from the perspective of Kardecist beliefs that Kardecists believe, but I just report this and discuss it. So to say when Kardec says, and Kardecists say and believe, that spirits in the other world answered the questions Kardec and others posed, and spirits in the other world psychograph through mediums, this is something that Kardecists believe, and I respect their belief in it. And, so this is fine. And then, but there is also, for those who don't accept the idea of communication from the spirits, there is still the notion that Kardec was open-minded. And he understood many of these things. He introduced in his thinking ideas that had consequences when they were syncretized, as I said before, with other things happening in Brazil, made possible experiments with spiritist surgery that had all kinds of interesting consequences, and from a scientific perspective, they have all kinds of interesting consequences.
So, as you're saying about these consequences and these experiences, what could you tell us in researching about the healing mediums, especially the spiritist healing mediums in Brazil. What have you learned? What are the main highlights from these observations and learning experiences?
Okay. You see, when I observed and came to understand and accepted the surgeries, and I focus again on the surgeries because if you think about it, even in terms of the background of what you tell during the intermissions when we're not talking, what you tell your listeners, much of this gets into notions of spiritist belief about relaxation and understanding and clearing your mind and so on and so forth, which is beautiful. But what I keep focusing on is that these surgeries make it possible to cut into people without anesthesia and antisepsis. Mm-hmm. How do we account for something so extreme? Now, you could do it in terms of spiritist belief, but as I said, I come from this from the perspective of a scientist. And I accept the basic materialism of science. So I asked questions, how could medicine possibly come to understand and explain what is happening? And this took me on another interesting voyage into psychotherapy and psychoneuroimmunology and immunology and other marginal branches that are becoming mainstream now, but which started off as innovative areas. And what this was based on essentially is having to come to grips with the thinking of Descartes and Cartesian thinking that is the basis for modern medicine. And that was the opposition made by Descartes between mind and body. And he looked at the body as medicine still does, using the metaphor of a machine to begin to do medicine. So if again you think about it, if you liken the body to a machine, what you do is replace parts using surgery, and that's what we do with surgery, up to the point that we replace hip joints and knee joints and we replace kidneys, heart valves, and so on and so forth. I mean, this is what you could do when you think in terms of the machine. We also use medications, and what medications do when we look at them is send chemical messages to the various organs of the body, which turn on what some call the body's own healing mechanisms. And it's this communication that becomes important. Now, Kardec, if you think about it, disagreed with Descartes in terms of the mind-body opposition because he introduced the spirit that interacted with the body, and this took you away from the strict opposition that we begin to go back to look at ways of mind-body interaction. But what I've been working with is the idea that comes, by the way, and I learned most of this from my dear friend and colleague, Dr. Ernest Rossi, who has been doing research on these issues from a very interesting background as long as I have. And that is the notion of reconceptualizing medicine, not in terms of the mind-body opposition, but seeing the body, the mind, the human organism as an informational system, where information is constantly flowing, and that information from different levels of the body eventually turns on genes that produce protein that produce the chemicals that send messages throughout the body. And what we are learning is that certain messages on the cognitive level, that is, things we can formulate in our brains mentally, can be translated, what we call transduced, into other informational systems that work through the different organs of the body down to the level of the cells and the genes. And if you think of this in terms of a communication system, what people believe may provide the information that turns on bodily systems starting at the level of the genes, so that this information can do the same thing chemical information does and turn on the body's own healing system.
So as you're giving this beautiful explanation, it comes to our mind that, as some of our discussion in your book, Spirits with the Scalpels, more and more people nowadays are paying attention to these combination of traditional medicine and spiritist approach in Brazil. We talk about spiritist psychiatric hospitals in Brazil,
right,
and etc. Even, as you say, beautiful chapter about this obsession, as you said, another form of spiritist treatment, which is non-invasive. So do you think there is some perspective that sooner or later we're going to incorporate these elements as well in the American healthcare?
Well, there are many people who have studied mental health treatment in Brazil who are trying very hard to introduce it as part of mental health therapy in the United States. What I have to do is go back for you in terms of my own thinking about this. As I told your listeners earlier, I really learned about Kardechism in Porto Alegre from my dear friends there. But while I was in Porto Alegre, I met some other rather fascinating and brilliant Kardecist thinkers who were doing other forms of therapy, following up on the notion of the disobsession. What a disobsession really becomes is the effort to communicate spirits who may be obsessing the living, and trying to do therapy with them so that they stop this, which gets us into the very interesting aspects of the forms of mental health therapy Kardecists have come up with, have introduced into spiritist hospitals. But my friends, people like those I've written about, José Lacerda de Azevedo, Ivan Harvey, and a whole series of others in Porto Alegre and elsewhere where people have picked up on their work, who have pushed things a little further than a lot of people are comfortable with. I keep coming back to the surgeries because that pushes medicine and others in a direction beyond where they're comfortable and gets them thinking. Because when you push beyond where you're comfortable, you start thinking about things. Well, what these people in Porto Alegre did was take the whole notion of what happened with spiritist surgeries. And that is, if spirits from the other world who are trained in medicine can come back and incarnate temporarily in the bodies of mediums and do surgeries, is it possible to do the reverse? That is, instead of spirits coming down from the other world to help the living in the material plane, is it possible to take people who are suffering in the material plane and, as they use the word, teleport them to the spirit plane to be treated by the advanced techniques there? Well, if you think about it, it sounds like science fiction.
Mm-hmm.
But what these people have been doing is working. A visitor from Puerto Rico in the 1960s taught them about certain forms of physics in which it is possible to concentrate intense amounts of energy to separate the material body from the other bodies spiritists believe the human organism is composed of, and particularly the astral body, which is of a very low density. And they believe they have figured out ways to teleport the astral body to the spirit plane, where they have an arrangement with spiritist doctors, because again, if you listen to Chico Xavier and other mediums, in the spirit world, people get sick and they have hospitals also. Only there's a level of development, particularly in the area of mental health, that we don't practice here on Earth. So if you send people to the other plane who are suffering from all kinds of mental health illness, everything that includes depression and epilepsy and a whole series of other things that I include a chapter in the book on this, and you send a medium with them who reports back, these people are able to sit in their centers while they teleport someone who is diagnosed with the problem that there is a malevolent spirit who is influencing them, and they are doing bad things like taking drugs or what have you. And what you attempt to do in the therapy using the disobsession is try to convince that malevolent spirit not to do these things, that really he should begin to learn what the doctrine is all about, that we go through a series of lives, a series of incarnations, and this malevolent spirit is really a low-level spirit that has to reincarnate and go back on its path to development. And very often these treatments are successful. The patient understands that he or she did something in a previous life that hurt and offended this person who is now getting revenge. Everybody works out an understanding of this. The patient recovers. The spirit supposedly goes back to reincarnating and continues its development, and the whole thing works out in a positive form of therapy. Well, as I say, this is pushing the envelope. This makes us think of additional things. Well, I'm the needle that keeps probing to do this because all of this is part of my own understanding.
It's amazing. It's fascinating, and certainly, as you're saying, it proposes that there is so much for scientists to investigate on the underlying mechanisms of these unquestionable phenomena that are happening through healing mediums, especially from the physical manifestation. I will never forget in your book when you mentioned Edson Queiroz' quote on the reason why the spirits actually had to cut the body, and they say because for people who don't believe, they actually need to see more material forms of it. So clearly, the cutting is not the actual action of the surgery, right?
No, he knows any good Cartus's believer knows that this is not necessary. And this is why some even argue that, well, we don't want to talk about this because it's really not necessary. But Edson was very clear, and Dr. Fritz was very clear, that he was doing this almost in defiance, saying to people, look at this. Look, tell me how you could explain it. Now let me teach you. Okay, this is what he I could understand it from his perspective. I could understand it from the perspective of some believers in Kardec's thinking who are trying to introduce mental health therapy who say, no, I don't want to go that far with it. Again, what I have to say is I'm essentially the outsider here raising questions. And if I add one more small piece of this that comes back to my interest in comparative religion and Brazil, when I finished, or as I was doing the studies of Kardecicism and Kardecist healing, I started to study other religions. And what I learned was that the popular religions in Brazil, and this goes back to Candomblé, the whole Afro-Brazilian tradition, popular Catholicism with its pilgrimage traditions, and even evangelical Christianity, all do healing. And it's a very important part of what they do. And what they do from a scientific perspective, even though the beliefs are different, has parallels with what happens in Kardecism in terms of the importance of trance and trance states where beliefs are introduced that are translated into other codes and stimulate the bodily systems through transduction. And this set up something very interesting because, again, as your listeners know, and I cite in the book, not everybody recovers. It depends upon your whole karmic situation, what you incarnate to learn, and all that happens. And I tell the story of a very dear friend of mine, the man who first invited me to Porto Alegre, the professor of education, when he died, when he disincarnated. And what it became, this colleague who taught me about Spiritism, who was in the faculty of education, he and a group of his fellow mediums educated my scientist, rationalist friend about death and dying in terms of the Kardecist tradition. And he made it easier for him. And if you think about this, we, especially in our rational world in the United States, death is a tragedy. It's the end of life. There's no more after that unless you accept the Christian notion or the Judaic notion of heaven or the Islamic notion of heaven and the afterlife, and some people have problems with that. Well, what Cicero did with his colleagues was make it easier for Paulo to die and for his family to accept this. Well, this is a branch of learning that's very, very important, as I understand, because there are all kinds of people who are getting into doing therapy with people who are facing life-ending illnesses. Well, here's something else that we could learn. And again, I come back and say, as a student of comparative religion, different religions open the door to our understanding of so many things that could be useful if we're willing to open our minds to begin to learn things that at times can be very difficult for us to accept because we have long histories of not wanting to think about them.
Dr. Greenfield, I hope we're as open-minded as you are. Because, as you're saying this, it reminds me deeply of what we said last week in the Kardec radio program about being culturally competent for the sake of healthy relationships in general, and the concept that David Hoop brought in 79 about being the pathway to being more culturally competent, and he says the ultimate goal is to be multicultural. And Kardec, as you're saying about the different religions and this universality of these phenomena and the teachings that we also see in Spiritism, Kardec addressed it in the Gospel According to Spiritism, and this is the fascinating component of it. He opens this very controversial work at his time, the Gospel According to Spiritism, and he opens with this very statement about the universality, saying clearly that Spiritism is not a man-made product. It's actually a work at four hands in which the incarnate and the discarnate world get together, and it's revealed to people all over the world, irrespective of the label, as you're saying. So from that perspective, you're so right. It's everywhere and elsewhere. And I think the main teaching you share with us is the need of being open-minded and sharing, not only sharing, but also accommodating the perspectives that come elsewhere. Dr. Greenfield, we're so deeply grateful for everything you've given us today. Would you like to share your final thoughts just for the program today, hoping we can bring you back in a later program at Kardec Radio?
Oh, well, again, I think what I'd like to do is end on the note you just raised, and it becomes so important for all of us to understand where other people are coming from. And if instead of reacting negatively, as we're too prone to do, if we try to understand other people's thinking, and particularly the way they view the world, the assumptions they make, and try to follow along with it and understand it, very often we learn very interesting things that if I go back to this notion of syncretism, that we can learn things and incorporate them into our world. To me, the beauty of following Kardec and Kardec's thinking through Brazilian history, many Brazilian followers of Kardec have been open to learning from other people and from other traditions, and they have enriched the practice as it operates in Brazil. And I think if we all extend this into the larger world of our lives, if instead of arguing and fighting with other people, we try to understand them on an individual level and a social and cultural and national level, we may have hope for the future of our world.
Oh, wow. Very inspirational. Thank you for your hard work, especially for sharing what you've shared, especially in this book, which I would recommend to everybody, The Spirits with the Scalpel. It's for every human being to read because you're talking about true phenomena of the human mind, of human reality, and invites us to new thinking, new understanding, and even more work that lies ahead of us to scientifically explain all of that. Thank you so much for being here with us and sharing your time as well, Dr. Greenfield. Thank you from the bottom of our hearts.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you.
So, dear listener, we are truly grateful to this opportunity. There is a lot to learn ahead of us, but don't go away. We're going to give a very brief minute of break, and when we come back, we're going to share with you a beautiful explanation that Kirsten DeMello brought to us about healing, the Spiritist view on healing. She summarized it so well, and we leave it to a beautiful end of the program at Kardec Radio today as we talk about healing and spirits and the Spiritist view. Stay here with us. In a minute, we'll be right back with you.
We will return to our program after these messages.
Strand Releasing proudly releases on DVD the Brazilian blockbuster Astro City, A Spiritual Journey. Based on the best-selling book by medium Chico Xavier, the film tells the story of André Luiz, a successful doctor who experiences an enlightening spiritual awakening after his death. Buy your copy now. Contact us at www.strandreleasing.com.
Nourish your soul with Kardec Radio.
Now in English, the book Action and Reaction by the Spirit Andrea Luiz, psychographed by Chico Xavier. Buy your copy online or via your ebook reader. Go to www.ediceiofamerica.com today.
Come and enjoy the 5th Spiritist Society of Baltimore Forum entitled Honoring Life, which will take place on February 11th from 6 p.m. to 8 p.m. at the Spirit Society of Baltimore headquarters, where topics such as abortion, death penalty, collective karma, and much more will be discussed. For more information, go to www.ssbaltimore.org.
And now we return to our program.
Dear listener, we are here amazed about the teachings that we're learning at Kardec Radio. Dr. Greenfield honored us with his presence, and now we are going to stream to you the Spiritist view on healing to wrap up the show with Kirsten DeMello in this new segment, Spiritist Moment. Let us listen to this.
Hello, dear Kardec Radio listeners, and I am Kirsten DeMello with the Spiritist Moment. Today, the topic is about spiritual surgeries, mediums that cure, psychic surgeries. In reflecting on this topic, oftentimes the things that cross our minds, perhaps, are where does illness come from? Anything from the common cold to something as serious as cancer. And these types of subjects, they affect us. Why? Because oftentimes either we're sick ourselves, somebody we love is sick, perhaps we've lost a loved one to cancer or any other form of illness. So it touches our soul profoundly in wanting to understand better the origins of illness. We look to Spiritism at this moment, and we learn through Spiritism where the origin of illness comes from. Because it's not in the physical body, because as Jesus once said, that it's not what you put in to the body that is hurtful, but what comes out of it. So we reflect with Spiritism, what does that mean as well? When we talk about illness, when we talk about sickness, where does it come from? Is it in the food that we eat? Or is it what comes out of us, which is the origin of our souls? When we reflect with Jesus' words, did he not mean that that which is inside of us is what makes us sick? Not necessarily what we put inside that makes us sick. And we also further reflect with Spiritism that sickness lies in the perispirit, the roots of the sickness being in the soul. So when we are able to cure and heal our soul, thus it reverberates through our perispirit and manifesting into our physical body. The same mechanism works when we are ill. A true illness does not lie within the physical body, but the physical body merely serves as a vehicle, either for our expiation, for our learning, for our betterment. How difficult this is to accept, and learning that it is because of our own imperfections that we become ill. Somewhere between our evolutionary process, something goes awry within us. But the most beautiful thing about Spiritism, and we learn with Jesus, that love and faith is what cures. When Jesus cured many and hundreds of thousands of people in his time, many times when people would thank him, Jesus, thank you for curing me, he said, my friend, my son, my dear, it is your faith that cured you. And like the woman who had the problem with bleeding, who merely touched his robe, and it is said that in the Bible she bled for many years, and simply by believing enough that by touching Jesus' robe that she'd be cured, and thus she was. And she was cured by her faith. And we could go into many more thoughts into these types of ideas about this particular one, but we know ultimately that sickness the origins of illness is not in the body. It is in the soul, dear friends. So, what does that mean for us? Well, for one, it means that perhaps I should look more in my inner world, how I'm living. What are my thoughts? What type of thoughts am I nourishing? To paraphrase something Chico Xavier once said, that in terms of our thoughts, that I can allow a bird to pass through my mind, but I just shouldn't allow it to make a nest. Meaning, a lot of thoughts cross our mind, but it doesn't mean that we give life to those thoughts. The negative ones, at least. The positive ones, yes, because they're good for us. But the negative, malnourishing thoughts that are not good for us, that do indeed cause us our illness. So let's continue to reflect every day, paying more attention to our thoughts, our feelings, and our own inner world to serve us better, so we can learn to cure and heal ourselves in our inner world to the depths of us, and also sharing with this with others and knowing we have that power within us. So, dear friends, reflect on these words and also the words of Joanna de Angelis in many of her books. She urges us every day to spend time reflecting on our day to better understand ourselves and others. And as always, from the Spiritist Moment, we wish you many blessings.
Dear listener, what a beautiful program. These 2 new segments really add so much to our program. And there is more ahead of us. Now let us wrap up the show today with a beautiful short prayer that Kardec taught us in the book, The Gospel According to Spiritism. Thanksgiving for a favor received, because when we talk about healing, we are being healed by God every day, though we may not perceive it. And Kardec talks about it in chapter 28 of the Gospel According to Spiritism, items 28 and 29. And he says one must not only consider matters of great importance as happy events. Those least in appearance are often the ones that have the most influence in our destiny. People easily forget the good and remember especially what afflicts them. If we recall every day the benefits we have received without having asked for them, we would often be surprised at the number that have slipped our memory, and we would be humbled by our gratitude. So right now, let us join in this beautiful short prayer by Allan Kardec. Infinitely good God, may your name be blessed for the benefits you have bestowed on us. We would be unworthy of them if we attributed them to chance or to our own merit. Good spirits who have carried out God's will, and especially you, our guardian angels, we give you thanks. Keep us from the thought of being proud for what we have received, or of using it for something that is not good. We thank you particularly for the show today. May you bless Dr. Greenfield and all of our listeners and our dear planet Earth. In gratitude, we keep our prayers up and stay with you. May God bless us all, dear listeners, as we come back next week with another program on demystifying mediumship with our colleague in Spiritism, Joe Musi from Toronto, Canada. May God bless us all.
Thank you for listening to Kardec Radio, broadcasting live every Saturday morning at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Email us and share your comments at www.kardecradio.com. Until next time, we wish you many blessings.